opposed to 4 basic provisions in the Senate-passed bill. Those of us who have worked on the Senate bill think those provisions are very important to address all of the people who need help in addressing sexual assault and domestic violence in this country. And one of the provisions that I have been most interested in is what you mentioned, John, when you're talking about the college. The fact is that 1 in 4 young women will be victims of rape and assault on campuses these days. And they're 4 more times likelier to be victims of sexual assault than women in the general population as a whole. And one of the provisions in the Senate-passed bill would provide support for those young women on college campuses. It would put in place requirements that colleges have to comply with in order to provide the support that young women need. And in fact, we were talking to Tim Russell, who some of you may remember used to be the police chief in Henniker, who has continued to work on this issue. Actually, when I was in the state Senate back in the early 90s, Tim and I worked on legislation in the state Senate to make recommendations around sexual assault on college campuses. And he talked about the importance of having the provisions that are in the Senate bill for particularly for small colleges and universities, because often on those campuses, if you're the victim of rape or sexual assault, you can't get away from your abuser. They know where you are. And unless there are some requirements so that you have to be supported, are allowed to have a different place to live if you happen to be in the same dormitory as your abuser, are allowed to take different classes so that you're not coming into contact with that person all the time. You're in a very difficult place, and often the victims drop out. So provisions around students, there are provisions in the Senate bill that deal with members of the LGBT community in New Hampshire. That's not been an issue for us because we've added those provisions to our law here in New Hampshire, but most states don't have those provisions that make sure that members of that gay and lesbian members are covered under the law. There are provisions in the Senate bill that deal with immigrants who are victims of abuse, and those provisions have been added at the request of law enforcement, who found that sometimes they were involved with immigrants, and because their abuser would contact authorities, they would be able to escape prosecution. The victim of the abuse might get sent back to the country that they were from, or the abuser might be able to escape, and so those provisions are there to make sure that law enforcement can go after abusers. And then finally, there are provisions that deal with Native Americans on tribes who are often victims of abuse by non-tribal members, and because of the way the law is set up, those non-tribal members can't be prosecuted. So there are some very important provisions, I think, in the Senate-passed version of the law that we really need to get done, and we need to get the House to come to the table to pass this legislation. The funding will run out at the end of September. The law is already expired. If we don't get this reauthorization, the kind of funds like you talked about, Peter, that we have not only in the county attorney's office here, but in the Nashville Police Department, in so many of the shelters that really provide assistance to people are going to go away. So let me stop there and just ask if you all would like to have anything else that you think is important that we should share as we're talking about the need to pass this legislation in Washington.
I would just like to say that I think some of the other elements of the reauthorization, the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, that a lot of talk focuses on funding, because for nonprofits, funding has become so critical over the last 24 months. But as fate would have it, I got a phone call from an advisory council member today who actually also works on a local housing authority where they receive federal funding for their subsidized housing. And she wanted to just remind me about a provision in the Violence Against Women Act that allows for if the one of the people on the lease is a victim of domestic violence, as this woman was, that the housing authority has the ability to bifurcate that lease if the abuser is the co-lessee. And I mean, this is very important. So the funding is important, yes, but some of these other provisions, and again, I knew that, but as my advisory council member said, it's on page 53 in the lease, that, you know, they're not usually reading all of that however many page lease, but again, that's a very important provision, because if she were to come forward and there was nothing she could do about that, she would lose her housing, and then therefore she wouldn't, because there would be no housing for her and her child. So those are some important, you know, I got that call today.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned
Right,
that,
yeah.
because you're right, that's something that doesn't often get mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the training too that's available through.
That really touches on one of the most critical aspects of domestic violence, which is that so often people who are victims of domestic violence don't report it because they have no other place to go. I mean, the shelters, the fact that the bifurcation of the housing authority lease in so many different areas. People who are victims of domestic violence are trapped in the situation that they're in, and they can't report it, they can't get away from it, they can't get out of it. So the importance of this legislation is just incredibly vital, not only for the people that in fact do get out of domestic violence, for those who are trapped in it.
Actually, Amy, would you share with everybody this story that we talked about from one of the women we met at the shelter?
One of the women that lived in our shelter unfortunately was not able to work or access any services while she was with her abuser, and she was married to him for 16 years. So the mental health treatment, medical treatment that she needed, she wasn't able to have access to. So when she left her abuser, she's now in a place where she is not able to apply for disability because she has no documentation to prove that she has a disability. On top of that, is not able to work because of her disability, and therefore is not able to apply for housing because she has no children and is not elderly at this point in time, and is not disabled. So she's sort of stuck in our shelter, not being able to really move forward in her life until she's able to show that she qualifies for all these other resources and services that are out there that she wasn't able to access while she was with her abuser.
Senator, I have two questions regarding the legislation, both relating to illegal or undocumented aliens, I guess say. One, is there any provision in it regarding protection from somebody that goes and reports? In other words, keep, say, a report being sent right on to INS or something like that. And sort of the related question was, is that provision or is that area one of the hang-ups in the House, or what are the hang-ups in the House?
The hang-ups in the House that they have used as a reason why they don't support those provisions is that there is a piece that would allow funding through the immigrant visas, and because of the most legislation that has funding as part of it is supposed to originate in the House versus the Senate, that's being used as the reason why they don't support the Senate bill. Now, I will say that while it's true there are those provisions, the fact is that whenever there's something that both chambers would like to see done, they get around those provisions pretty easily. The transportation bill that we just passed, they waived those provisions. So I think that's really a red herring for why they don't want to see those provisions included in the bill. There has been some misinformation that has been put out that what those provisions would do is allow illegal immigrants to stay in the United States, and that's just not accurate. That's not what it does at all. Other questions or thoughts, Molly?
Senator, just to follow up on that question, if in fact
don't know the answer. I think it's very unfortunate. Because this is legislation that, when it was first passed in 1994, had overwhelming support, was reauthorized during the Bush administration, and again, had overwhelming bipartisan support. And it's hard to understand why now it suddenly is hung up because of opposition. I mean, they said it was because of the points at issue are the 4 points that I laid out. Those are the differences between the House and Senate bill. Now, I think it's hard to understand why provisions that would expand and make sure that everyone who needs help through the Violence Against Women Act is able to get that, and clarifies that, why that's, the House has now decided that they oppose it for that reason. I think it's unfortunate because, as I said, here in New Hampshire, because of our provisions in the law, we know that if you're gay or lesbian, you can get the support under the law, and we think that's appropriate. Unfortunately, there are people who oppose having those provisions in the law nationwide, and so it's not clear. We know that gay couples experience domestic violence at about the same rate as heterosexual couples, and Amanda, you could probably speak to this very well. And we know that in many cases, those victims have been turned away because the law is not clear about whether they should be helped or not. And what the Senate passed version would do is make it very clear that they should also be helped through the legislation. Do you want to add to that, Amanda?
Yeah, I would just say this is unprecedented, that this has just sort of become political, and it's very unfortunate. We have hope that this will be reconciled before recess in the fall. But again, these are victims have disabilities, victims are gay, victims are lesbian, and in New Hampshire, we support coalition member programs support all victims regardless of their gender and their status, and we think it should be across the board. There should be federal mandates. So I hope that these sticking points will be resolved. It shouldn't be playing politics with survivors and victims. There's people who lose out in the end. So.
And as Amanda says, time is running out because the funding ends at the end of September, and we have a limited number of days when Congress will be in Washington. So we need to get this resolved. I think if you look at the vote in the House, there was a bipartisan vote in opposition to what the House passed. So there were a number of Republicans who voted with Democrats in opposition. Just as on the Senate side, there was bipartisan support for the Senate bill. So it seems to me that that should send a very clear message that we need to get together and figure this out so that we make sure that people get the help they need. Mike's giving me the high sign. Let me just recognize Mike Glassett, who many of you know, who's the state director of my office here in New Hampshire, and Pam Slack, I know you all know her, who works so hard in the office, and Sarah Holmes, who also works with me. So we are here to try and do everything we can to be helpful, and I really appreciate all of the work that all of you do here to help those people who are in abusive situations who need help. So thank you. And thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. Our women today, I think, they were just thrilled when we told them yesterday that they were going to get a visit. And they really enjoyed speaking with you, so thank you for that. Thank you.
And I think it's important to point out that in the Senate, all the women in the Senate supported the Senate bill, Republicans and Democrats. And I think that's an important message to send to everybody, that this is not, as we've all said, this is not a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. This is an issue that affects rich and poor, as Amanda said so well, disabled,
you.
Thank you very much.
So we're doing some places about right now, and other places. Well, and I think